There are tons of lists and videos on the internet featuring the biggest box office bombs. But somehow, every single one of them has different films and rankings. No one can ever seem to agree on what the actual worst performing movies of all time are. Some of the articles appear to be solely opinion pieces, or they're missing an important part of financial information that can severely affect the final numbers. My goal with this project is not just to determine the biggest box office bombs, but also to provide a bit of clarity into the hazy world of box office calculations. Figuring out how much a movie made at the box office is easy. Deciphering the actual profit or loss of a film, on the other hand, is a bit more complicated. There's a lot of factors that go into the equation, from the production budget, which can occasionally be hard to pinpoint, to the marketing costs, which can be infuriatingly difficult to figure out. So bear with me as I try and simplify this process as best I can. Let's take Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 as an example. Now, the film made approximately $845 million worldwide at the box office. When glancing at that looks like a runaway hit. But we also have to factor in how much the theaters are taking for playing the film. The domestic cut for theaters is about 45%, which means the studios get about 55% of the profits. Internationally, that number's a little different, with the theaters getting about 60% and the studios taking about 40% of the cut. Then there's China, which takes a staggering 75% of the box office earnings, leaving just 25% for the studios. Things get even more complicated, with studios sometimes using their clout to get an even bigger percentage of the domestic cut during the first couple weeks of their film's release. Now, due to the varying terms in the contracts between studios and distributors, each film is going to have their own unique domestic and international box office percentages. Unfortunately, there is no possible way to know exactly what those numbers are, and for simplicity's sake, and my own sanity, we're going to call it a 55-40-25 split across. Okay, so back to Guardians 3. The film made $845 million at the box office. Minus the cut for the theaters, that brings our total profit to about $379 million. Not too bad. But Guardians 3 had a production budget of $250 million. And on top of that, marketing and distribution costs of $150 million, for a total budget of $400 million. So now we take our remaining box office total, $379 million, and subtract the studio's investment in the film, $400 million, and are left with a total worldwide theatrical loss of $21 million. Now remember, this movie is considered a hit, but all those years of pre-production, filming, post-production, and in this case, an investment of $400 million, just to basically break even, seems like a lot of work for not a ton of reward. But you also have to remember that the film will live on long after its theatrical run. And in this particular case, virtually every dollar earned once it leaves theaters is pure profit. Figuring out combined Blu-ray and streaming sales for films is virtually impossible without insider help, as beyond some DVD and Blu-ray sales, those numbers are very rarely released to the public. Depending on the popularity of the film, the life of a movie on home media and streaming, on average, could net somewhere in the $50 million to $250 million range, with some movies making hundreds of millions of dollars more than that. But again, it's very hard to determine accurately. Then there's merchandising, which for franchises could mean hundreds of millions to potentially billions in additional revenue. While I can't say exactly how much Guardians 3 will make after theaters, I'd say 200 to 300 million is likely in home media and streaming, with an additional 50 to 100 million in merchandise sales. What I can tell you is that home media is unfortunately becoming less and less relevant, and therefore less profitable, as studios continue to pour money into their streaming services. But that's a topic for a future video. Suffice it to say, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 has put in the hard work, and basically broke even in theaters. And Disney can rest easy with this film, knowing that every time someone rents, buys, or streams the movie, it's money in the bank. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for the movies we're going to be talking about today. From a financial perspective, these are simply the worst of the worst. Almost all of these movies will never turn a profit, and if they do, it won't be for decades and decades. Now, some of the rankings of these films may be controversial, so I've run all the numbers multiple times, and I promise you that plus or minus a few million, This ranking is as accurate as you can get with the information available to the public on the internet. At the end of the video, I'll also be providing the top 20 with inflation included. The rankings of these movies were shifting so much while I was compiling this list that I actually had to put this project on hold for months, as films were coming out that were actively bumping others off the list and were constantly affecting placement. But as of October 2023, here are the top 20 biggest box office bombs of all time. This film is separated from the top 20 by only $600,000, so I figured it deserves a mention. In a post-apocalyptic world where cities ride on wheels and consume each other to survive, two people meet in London and try to stop a conspiracy. That has to be one of the worst synopses for a film I've ever heard. Can you imagine being in a pitch meeting for this film and hearing someone describe a potential financial investment with that sentence? Peter Jackson, the director of The Lord of the Rings and King Kong, produced this film, which was an adaptation of a novel of the same name by author Philip Reeve. The film was the directorial debut of Christian Rivers, who was the visual effects supervisor on The Lord of the Rings and longtime collaborator with Peter Jackson. Mortal Engines was released during a very competitive December 2018 with a $110 million budget and a ridiculously high marketing budget of $143 million. The movie didn't connect with audiences or critics at all, with the film getting just a 26% score on Rotten Tomatoes and boasting one of the worst second weekend drops of all time at 77%. By the end of its release, Mortal Engines managed only a worldwide gross of $83.9 million, which after the theater's cut, that total would dwindle to just $34.8 million, and the film would end its run with a theatrical loss of just over $218 million. There have been numerous live-action adaptations of the Peter Pan story over the years, and each one has struggled at the box office. 2015's Pan is no exception. Starring Hugh Jackman, Garrett Hedlund, and Rooney Mara, this $150 million movie was an origin story of the Peter Pan character. Unfortunately, due to either fatigue of the source material or an overwhelming lack of interest, the film was a total disaster. It was panned by critics, no pun intended, and only managed just $129 million worldwide, meaning just a paltry $56 million after the theaters took their cut, against a $275 million total budget, for a total loss of $218.9 million. Although Disney released Peter Pan and Wendy straight to Disney Plus in 2023, because of the abysmal performance of Pan, it will likely be quite a few years before any studio will roll the dice and release another live-action Peter Pan film in theaters. In 2019, fans of The Matrix got a very unexpected announcement that a fourth film in the franchise was in production, this time with only one of the Wachowskis directing. Lana Wachowski said she wanted to return to the world of The Matrix after the unfortunate death of her parents, and she found comfort in thinking of the potential return of her favorite characters. However, the meta-narrative of the film heavily implies that Warner Brothers was going to forge ahead with a fourth installment, with or without her involvement. Now, I have an emotional stake in this one, because I've been a huge fan of the franchise since I was a kid. I even got the chance to chase Neo and Trinity around the streets of San Francisco as an extra for a week of night shoots, which was a very surreal experience. Unfortunately, the film received mixed reviews, and it ended up being a very heavy-handed, mostly forgettable installment. It's unclear if there will be any further sequels in the future, but the studio will likely be looking to reboot the franchise at some point. The Matrix Resurrections grossed just over $157 million. After the theater's cut, that total was just $66.5 million, against a combined budget of $290 million, for a worldwide theatrical loss of just under $223.5 million. This was also the last Warner Brothers movie released in theaters and HBO Max simultaneously, which was a gimmick that lasted for 1 year during the height of the pandemic. For the studio, this experiment was largely a failure, acting as only a hindrance to the box office potential of those films. The origins of Cowboys and Aliens dates all the way back to 1997, but it wasn't until 2009 that director Jon Favreau would come on board. The director would overcome several issues, including the loss of leading man Robert Downey Jr. and Universal wanting the film shot in 3D. Favreau was adamant that westerns should be shot in anamorphic widescreen on 35mm film, with no 3D conversion in post-production. Daniel Craig eventually replaced Robert Downey Jr., and Harrison Ford was cast opposite him, in an effort to bring gravitas to a film with an already comedic title of Cowboys and Aliens. With James Bond, Indiana Jones, a director coming off of Iron Man, and Steven Spielberg executive producing, Universal was expecting nothing less than a massive hit. Although the movie looked fantastic, the film got mixed and negative reviews from critics, and the $163 million blockbuster was nearly beaten in its opening weekend by the Smurfs. With a combined budget of $313 million, the film would only manage just under $175 million, which, after the theater's cut, dwindled to just $85 million. And Cowboys and Aliens would end its run with a theatrical loss of $228 million. Coming off the massive critical and financial hit Wonder Woman in 2017, the sequel was highly anticipated. However, Wonder Woman 1984 ended up being a bloated, pandering mess, one that was largely panned critically, and a monumental financial disaster. This was the first of those Warner Brothers films that debuted both in theaters and HBO Max simultaneously. The gimmick lasted from December 2020 to December 2021, and was credited as the main reason that director Christopher Nolan parted ways with Warner Brothers after working together for nearly 20 years. Fun fact, both Barbie and Oppenheimer opened in theaters on July 21st, 2023. Warner Brothers' decision to release Barbie on July 21st came only after Nolan had announced the same date for his film Oppenheimer months earlier. This move was perceived entirely as a not-so-subtle middle finger to Christopher Nolan from Warner Brothers for choosing to sever ties with the studio. Ironically, this decision ended up servicing both films, as the release of the two highly anticipated films led many to affectionately declare the event Barbenheimer, and the films went on to be two of the highest-grossing movies of 2023. Alright, back to this bullshit. With a $300 million combined total budget, Wonder Woman 2 only managed $170 million, with unfortunately the vast majority of that total coming from international ticket sales. After the theater's take, the film was only able to recoup about $71 million, for a theatrical loss of nearly $229 million. This was the official end of Fox's X-Men cinematic universe. Technically, the spin-off The New Mutants was released after this, but that was only because of numerous delays with that film that saw its release date pushed back by nearly 2.5 years. In the case of Dark Phoenix, they absolutely saved the worst for last. After a series of abysmal test screenings, the film underwent 3 months of extensive reshoots, and the third act was completely reshot. This was a film that Disney inherited after their merger with 20th Century Fox, and they were trying desperately to make the film a hit. Once again, the franchise tackles the Dark Phoenix storyline, which was already attempted with very mixed results in the 2006 sequel, The Last Stand. The biggest sin this film commits is that it's really, really boring. Not just that, but the look of the film is just awful. The whole movie being unnecessarily dark. Another thing that's never addressed is that all the characters look basically the same age they did in X-Men First Class, which came out 8 years before Dark Phoenix, but takes place a full 30 years before this. Absolutely no attempt was made to age the characters up appropriately, as most of the legacy characters should be in their 50s and 60s at this point. Overall, Dark Phoenix is an incredibly forgettable film, and a coda to a franchise that most fans wish was never made at all. Thanks to those hefty reshoots, Dark Phoenix had a combined budget of $333 million. The movie managed $252 million, but with the majority of that coming internationally, that total would dwindle to just $102 million after the theater's cut. For a worldwide theatrical loss, of $231 million. Now that the X-Men franchise is officially part of the MCU, it's likely we'll see a complete reboot of the X-Men in a few years. We've already got a cameo from Patrick Stewart's Professor X in Doctor Strange 2, and Hugh Jackman's Wolverine will make a major appearance in Deadpool 3, which will be the MCU's first R-rated film. This was an original sci-fi film from the Wachowskis, who are making their second appearance on this list. Perhaps best known for being that movie where Channing Tatum wears elf ears, and featuring Eddie Redmayne's worst performance, one where he delivers all of his lines by either whispering or screaming. For the Wachowskis, Jupiter Ascending was a very ambitious $210 million swing and a miss. There's really not that much else to say about this one. Back in 2015, I think I got about 45 minutes into this movie, paused it for whatever reason, and until I compiled this list, literally never thought of it again. Jupiter Ascending had a combined budget of $310 million, and managed a worldwide box office total of $184 million. However, once again, the film relied heavily on international ticket sales, so that number dwindles much farther to just $74 million, for a worldwide theatrical loss of $236 million. Turning Red was created with every intent to be a full-blown theatrical release, but at the last minute, Disney decided to abandon the domestic release and instead put the film for free on Disney+. And by free, I mean subscribers didn't have to pay an additional fee to watch the film. Turning Red was released theatrically only in a handful of countries internationally. Allegedly, Pixar was furious at Disney over this decision, as their last two films up until that point, Soul and Luca, had also been released internationally only, and simultaneously sent to the Disney Plus platform. They were hoping that Turning Red would be Pixar's triumphant return to the big screen in March 2022. Luca and Soul being sent to Disney Plus was a situational move, due entirely to the pandemic. Turning Red didn't really have that excuse, as theaters had been back in full swing for almost a full year at that point. Although bizarrely, Disney still credited the pandemic as the main reason they decided to forego a domestic release. Even though Soul and Luca were given the same international-only treatment, those two films fared much better than Turning Red, which had a combined budget of $250 million and only managed $20 million in its theatrical run. And that already tiny total was diluted to just $8 million after the theater's cut. And the film ended its run with a theatrical loss of $242 million. Director Brad Bird had enormous success with Disney and Pixar, with both The Incredibles and Ratatouille. And his first live-action film, Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol, was a critical and financial hit, so Disney had no issues handing him the keys to Tomorrowland, a mostly original sci-fi fantasy film starring George Clooney that was loosely based on the Tomorrowland section of their theme parks. Although the film itself was okay, mostly forgettable, it ended up being memorable for a completely different reason. Tomorrowland marked a massive turning point for the Disney brand, as this film's failure is the exact point where the studio's interest in big-budget, original ideas came to an end. At this point, in the summer of 2015, Disney had already acquired Lucasfilm and Marvel, and they had just put out the first few live-action remakes of their animated films. After Tomorrowland flopped, Disney went largely full steam ahead into their live-action remakes, Star Wars, Pixar sequels, and Marvel films. The company was no longer interested in risks, and if it wasn't an established and profitable IP, those projects were either shelved or simply never even considered. The most not-so-subtle example of this was the cancellation of Tron 3, which came 6.5 days after Tomorrowland's release date. The film would have been a direct sequel to Tron Legacy, and seen the return of original cast members Olivia Wilde and Garrett Hedlund, as well as director Joseph Kosinski, and very potentially featuring another iconic score from Daft Punk. Tron Legacy wasn't the hit that Disney was hoping for, and although the film made enough in home media and merchandising to justify a sequel, it's clear that after Tomorrowland, Tron fell sharply into the risk category for Disney, and with the acquisition of a plethora of more lucrative franchises, Tron 3 was abandoned. Since then, Disney has opened 2 Tron attractions in their parks, one in Shanghai and the other in Disney World. And with the popularity of those rides, they felt confident enough to greenlight Tron 3 once again. This time with apparently none of the previous film's cast returning, no Daft Punk, and the director of Maleficent 2.
Great job!
Although Tomorrowland is now largely forgotten, the precedent that it set for Disney is still being felt today. The film was, of course, a monumental flop. With a $340 million total budget, the movie managed just $209 million, which is before the theater's cut, which took its total down to just under $95 million, for a theatrical loss of $245 million. Since The Flash was announced in 2016, it was delayed so many times, I honestly lost count. Over the years, the project went through at least 5 directors before finally settling on Andy Muschietti, who had recently directed the horror film It for the studio. The film also went through various screenplay changes and page 1 rewrites. It wouldn't be until 5 years after the movie's announcement that cameras would finally roll on the project. It would take over 2 more years for The Flash to be released, with further delays due to star Ezra Miller's bizarre series of arrests and violent outbursts. Many speculated the film would ultimately be dumped onto Max, or canceled entirely for a tax write-off, like Warner Brothers had done months earlier with their other DC movie, Batgirl, which had completely finished principal photography by the time it was shelved. However, Warner Brothers refused to abandon The Flash, instead shifting the marketing to emphasize their multiverse, focusing heavily on Michael Keaton's return as Batman, as well as the inclusion of Supergirl. Meanwhile, Ezra Miller was kept entirely out of the press tour for the film. The critics were torn on the movie, and fan reaction wasn't much better. Mainstream audiences stayed far away from this one, resulting in DC's biggest flop yet. With a combined budget of $370 million, the film only managed $270 million, which after the theater's cut, amounted to only $120 million. And The Flash would end its run with a theatrical loss of nearly $250 million. Interestingly, within just 5 weeks of each other, Warner Brothers released both The Flash and Barbie, one becoming the most profitable movie in Warner Brothers history, and the other going on to be the studio's biggest box office bomb in 100 years. "2023's Haunted Mansion was Disney's second attempt to bring its iconic attraction to life, and unfortunately, for both the studio and audiences, its second failure. Waiting for this movie to finish its theatrical run was the biggest reason this video took me so long to complete, as even with their flops, Disney drags the theatrical life of their films out for months and months. In this particular case, Disney wanted this movie still in theaters for Halloween, and even as I'm recording this, the numbers are still trickling in, meaning I'll have to wait even longer to release this video. Thanks, Haunted Mansion, you piece of shit. While no one expected this movie to do great, it was genuinely shocking just how terrible it performed. The film was nothing short of a critical and financial disaster. Produced with a total budget of $307 million, the movie managed just under $118 million, and after the theater's cut, walked away with just over $57 million, for a worldwide theatrical loss of $250 million. I already made a video about this film and its troubled production. If you're curious about the history of this one, I'd recommend checking that one out. This was a spin-off of Pixar's franchise Toy Story, and from the very first trailer, Lightyear was confusing audiences. Okay, so it's Buzz Lightyear, but now it's Chris Evans, not Tim Allen voicing the character. So this is an origin story, but this is a different version of Buzz, and he's a real person now? Then about a month before the release of the film, Pixar tried to explain that Lightyear was the film that Andy from the Toy Story movies saw when he was a little boy in the mid-90s, and that made him want the Buzz Lightyear toy that we all know and love. Okay, clearly the interest in this film was virtually non-existent, and the marketing did very little to convince audiences to show up or have any reason to care about the film. With a $200 million production budget and a $160 million marketing budget, Lightyear would only manage a worldwide total of $226 million, which, after the theater's cut, brought that total down to about $108 million, for a theatrical loss of $251 million. 2022 was not kind to Pixar, and the releases of both Lightyear and Turning Red were ultimately a financial gut punch in what was supposed to be a return to form for the studio after the pandemic forced their previous 3 films onto Disney+. Clearly, Disney is struggling to turn their theme park adaptations into successful films, as this is the 3rd attempt to end up on this list. After the success of Pirates of the Caribbean: The Curse of the Black Pearl, Disney quickly announced a film adaptation of another one of their iconic rides, Jungle Cruise, in 2004. However, there wouldn't be any further progress until 2015, when Emily Blunt and Dwayne Johnson would come on board. 3 years after that, production finally began, and after a series of numerous release date delays, Jungle Cruise ended up being one of the first movies to come out after theaters reopened for good during the pandemic in summer 2021. With the star power of the 2 leads and a plot reminiscent of Pirates of the Caribbean, audiences seemed to love the film, and so it was shocking just how poorly Jungle Cruise performed. With a total budget of $362 million, the film made just under $221 million. But we all know by now that number only gets smaller, and by the end of its run, Jungle Cruise managed just under $105 million, for a worldwide theatrical loss of $257 million. This was the final movie to be released as part of Disney Plus's Premier Access, which was a premium release strategy created to recoup losses the company suffered as a result of the pandemic. Ultimately, only 5 movies were released under the Premier Access banner. But unlike HBO Max's similar strategy, Premier Access cost Disney Plus subscribers $30 per movie, and Jungle Cruise made an additional $66 million through the platform, which helped cushion the financial blow of the theatrical release. Allegedly, a sequel is in development, but after that big of a flop, it's hard to imagine Jungle Cruise 2 is anywhere near a top priority for Disney. '47 Ronin was a 2013 action film starring Keanu Reeves, made right before Keanu saw a career renaissance with the John Wick franchise. The movie had a ridiculously high budget of $175 million, but Universal demanded additional reshoots to get Keanu's character more screen time, and this only ballooned the budget even further to $225 million. The film was absolutely demolished by critics, and regardless of its prime Christmas Day release, audiences weren't interested at all. With a total budget of $325 million, the film managed only $151 million, with the vast majority coming from international sales. After the theater's take, the studio was left with just $66 million, for a worldwide theatrical loss of $258.5 million. Shockingly, there was actually a sequel to this movie, Blade of the 47 Ronin, which was a direct-to-DVD and streaming sequel released in 2022. And as of this recording, 47 Ronin stands alone as the only film on this list to actually get a direct sequel. Onward had the unfortunate timing of opening just 2 weeks before movie theaters were forced to close due to the pandemic, and therefore its box office prospects were significantly affected. Although the opening weekend numbers weren't great to begin with, it's likely that the film would have grossed a couple $100 million more at the box office. While the film was rushed onto Disney Plus shortly after it was pulled from theaters, Premier Access wouldn't be created for another 6 months, so unlike Jungle Cruise, Onward didn't benefit from any additional revenue with its release on the platform. With a $325 million total budget, the movie made just $142 million, but when all was said and done, Onward ended its run with just $64 million, with a worldwide theatrical loss of $260.5 million. Unfortunately, this would be the first in a series of misfires for Pixar that continues to this day. Onward, Soul, Luca, Turning Red, Lightyear, and Elemental all failed to turn a profit, and cumulatively lost over $1.2 billion at the box office. The next release for the studio, Inside Out 2, is the most likely candidate to break this streak, and I really hope it does. But with a June 2024 release date, it will come a full 5 years after Toy Story 4, which was the last time a Pixar release was profitable theatrically. The production of Solo: A Star Wars Story was notoriously troubled. The original directors of the film, Phil Lord and Chris Miller, the directors of the Lego Movie and 21 Jump Street, were fired after almost 5 months of filming, with their comedic style apparently clashing with Kathleen Kennedy's vision for the film. And Ron Howard was brought in to finish filming and for extensive reshoots. Lord and Miller were fired having completed roughly 85% of principal photography, and according to the Directors Guild of America, in order to be credited as director and have the right to oversee all post-production decisions, they must have filmed a minimum of 90% of the film, which means Disney waited until the very last week to fire them. This movie was a very sobering reality check for Disney. After The Force Awakens made over $2 billion at the box office, Disney thought they could do no wrong. Announcements came pouring in that they intended to release a new Star Wars film every year, indefinitely. They followed Force Awakens up with Rogue One, and the year after that released The Last Jedi. And that was precisely where fans began to turn on Disney's Star Wars. Bizarrely, the studio chose to release Solo a mere 5 months later, and audiences mostly ignored the film, due largely to oversaturation of the brand and a poor marketing campaign. Solo had a staggering total budget of $451 million and managed a worldwide total of $393 million. After the theater's take, Disney would walk away with just under $187 million, for a theatrical loss of $264 million. It's worth noting that due to the popularity of the brand, Solo will likely recoup much of that loss with its merchandising and home media sales. Out of all the films on this list, the budget of Solo was the hardest to pinpoint. While some report the film only cost $250 million, others claim it was at least $275 million, with some even claiming Solo cost as much as $300 million to produce. A perfect reference point is the production budget of Star Wars Episode 7: The Force Awakens. Once thought to be between $260 and $300 million, was revealed in 2023 to actually have been $447 million, making it the most expensive movie ever made. Disney clearly spares no expense with their Star Wars films, and in Solo's case, with a full 70 to 80% of the film having to be reshot, that meant a complete script overhaul, scrapped visual effects sequences, and an additional 3 full months of production. Solo, just like Rogue One, was planned with an original budget of $200 million, so after all the months of reshoots, a final budget of $275 million seems to hold the most weight. If the $300 million number were true for Solo, that would actually make it the biggest box office bomb of all time. Maybe in a few years, just like with The Force Awakens, the true number will be revealed, but until then, Solo will have to settle for number 6. Regardless, after all the seemingly infinite amount of money thrown at this movie, the end result was a bland, forgettable, tonally disjointed experience, and almost Lucasfilm's biggest train wreck to date. And as fate should have it, that honor actually goes to our next film. Rumors of Indiana Jones 5 were happening pretty much the entire 15 years after the release of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Several years after Disney acquired Lucasfilm for $4 billion, the project was formally announced, with an initial release date of July 2019, and the movie would allegedly feature the final John Williams score ever. However, the production was constantly delayed. Steven Spielberg was attached to direct as late as February 2020, but ultimately he passed on helming the project himself, with the reins handed over to director James Mangold, with the film eventually slated for a June 2023 release date. In classic Disney form, The budget for the film was inflated beyond reason, coming in at a staggering $295 million, with an additional $150 million in marketing costs, for a total budget of just under $445 million. Dial of Destiny only managed a worldwide total of $384 million, and after the theater's take, ended its run with just under $180 million, for a worldwide theatrical loss of $265 million. Now, I mostly enjoyed the film, particularly the last 20 minutes or so, and I thought it was a solid send-off to an iconic character, and it's sad to think that Harrison Ford brought back Indy one last time, only for that effort to end up in the top 5 biggest bombs of all time. With its $445 million total budget, Dial of Destiny would have had to gross nearly $1 billion just to break even theatrically. Even if the production budget were trimmed down to a more reasonable $200 million, that wouldn't have been nearly enough to save it, as the movie would still have lost an insane amount of money for the studio. Like Solo, a Star Wars story, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny will likely recoup much of its losses in its life after theaters. Although it'll have a hard time breaking even in the near future, it's still a very real possibility it will in the years to come, due to it being an installment in one of the most iconic franchises of all time. Just like with Haunted Mansion, I've been waiting for Dial of Destiny to finish its theatrical run for months now. Although the film is no longer playing domestically, somehow, after 4.5 months, it's still playing in a handful of countries internationally, and averaging a gross of about $50,000 per week, or about $20,000 after the theater's cut. At this point, I can't wait any longer for Disney to cut its losses with the film, and unless the studio keeps Dial of Destiny out for another year, that weekly amount is nowhere near enough to move its placement on this list. Strange World was an animated Disney film that released in late 2022, but if you've never heard of it, you're almost certainly not alone. The film had easily one of the worst marketing campaigns of all time relative to its budget. If you were lucky enough to actually see a trailer or TV spot for this movie, you'd probably still be hard-pressed to decipher what the actual plot was. The film had a production budget of $180 million and a marketing budget of $130 million. I honestly have no idea how Disney spent that much money on the marketing campaign, given how little it did to actually build awareness of the movie's existence. Strange World managed just $73 million, and that's before the theater's cut, taking its actual total down to just $35 million, for a worldwide theatrical loss of $275 million. Disney didn't release the movie in more than 20 countries due to the LGBTQ censorship in those places, as the film prominently featured a gay main character. While the loss of those markets certainly played a role in the film's failure, given that the movie only made $21 million domestically, it's clear Strange World was destined to land somewhere on this list, regardless. Set to open less than 2 weeks after movie theaters were shut down due to the pandemic, Disney was forced to push back their live-action remake of Mulan until late summer 2020. At that point, only a fraction of theaters were actually open, and they decided to debut the film only internationally, skipping a domestic theatrical release altogether. If the film's release date was just 1 week earlier that March, Disney would have likely spent another $50 million on marketing the film, as the majority of money spent on advertising for movies is usually spent in the last few weeks of its campaign. And if Disney were able to spend all of their marketing budget, Mulan would actually become the biggest box office bomb of all time. Fortunately for Disney, they only had time to spend $100 million marketing the film before its domestic release was scrapped. And with a $200 million production budget, the movie carried a total budget of $300 million. Mulan managed just $70 million in its international release, but since the majority of that came from China, that total would dwindle to just $21.8 million, for a theatrical loss of $278 million. Mulan was released on Disney Plus in the fall of 2020, with the movie being the first of the platform's premier access releases. Although the final numbers weren't made available to the public, it's likely the $30 premium helped Mulan make up an estimated $80 million of that loss back for Disney. Coming off the success of the Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy, director Gore Verbinski was given the opportunity to merge his passion for action, westerns, and weirdness, and the result was 2013's The Lone Ranger. The character first appeared in a 1933 radio show, and that eventually led to a series of books and a popular TV show that ran from 1949 to 1957. The film adaptation was in development at Disney for almost 6 years, with Jerry Bruckheimer attached as producer. Eventually, Johnny Depp would join the cast, as well as the writers of the first 4 Pirates movies. With the star, producer, writers, and director of Pirates of the Caribbean all back together, Disney was seeing a massive financial opportunity. But in August 2011, after the financial failure of another high-concept western, Cowboys and Aliens, Disney suspended production on the film because of concerns over the $250 million budget. The filmmakers promised to reduce the budget to $215 million, and the film was back in production. But due to a number of issues during filming, the film went way over schedule, and the budget crept right back up to its original number of $250 million. Although the character was largely unknown to modern audiences, there was still hope that the Pirates connections would be enough to make the film a massive summer hit. Unfortunately, the film was the complete opposite of that, and audiences had absolutely zero interest in seeing Johnny Depp run around the desert with a dead bird on his head. With a total budget of $400 million, The Lone Ranger managed only $260 million, and after the theater's cut, ended its run with just $115 million, for a worldwide theatrical loss of $284.3 million. Well, here we are. The John Carter of Mars novels were written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, same author as Tarzan, with the story first appearing in serialized form as early as 1912. The Barsoom series would go on to have a profound impact on pop culture over the next century, as the John Carter character was a direct inspiration for properties like Flash Gordon, Superman, Dune, Star Wars, and Avatar. John Carter was directed by Andrew Stanton, who had previously helmed Finding Nemo and WALL-E for Disney and Pixar prior to landing his first live-action job. Stanton was passionate about the source material, campaigning hard for Disney to give him a chance to bring this property to the big screen. Now, this was about 3 years before the purchase of Lucasfilm, and the studio heads at Disney were very intrigued by the idea of potentially having their own Star Wars. The film was originally titled John Carter of Mars, which was the title of the final book in the series. The president of Disney Marketing, an employee who was hired with no previous movie experience, decided midway through the film's production to drop "of Mars" from the title. She came to this decision only by looking at the financial history of other films that had Mars in the title. This move did nothing to help the marketing campaign, which was already struggling to find its own voice. A campaign which bafflingly never bothered to highlight the talent behind the camera, or the profound inspiration that the John Carter character had on filmmaking over the last 100 years. Now, to top it all off, you got a dull and generic title of John Carter, which did nothing to help the movie stand out. At the premiere of the film, star Taylor Kitsch was walking the red carpet when the Disney studio chief took him aside for a moment, whispering to him that the film was going to be a disaster. Unfortunately, he was very right. The movie had a production budget of $263.7 million after tax rebates, and a marketing budget of $150 million, for a total budget of $413.7 million. The movie managed just $284 million. After the theaters took their piece, the film would only go on to make $124 million for Disney, for a total theatrical loss of $289 million. And John Carter now holds the title for the biggest box office bomb of all time. Now, since the final marketing budget was never 100% confirmed for the film, and the number 2 spot is only $4.7 million away from John Carter, it's entirely within the realm of possibility that the Lone Ranger could actually take the top spot. But the truth is, we may never know for sure. The only hint we have to go off of in regards to John Carter's true marketing budget is that Disney took a very public $200 million write-down for the film, which is simply insane. When it comes to longevity after theatrical release, John Carter definitely has the edge over the Lone Ranger, as there were some very passionate defenders of John Carter, and there seems to be a large group of filmgoers who genuinely love the movie. Theoretically, John Carter should make more in home media and merchandise in the long run, which would make the Lone Ranger the bigger overall loss. But since this list strictly pertains to the biggest box office bombs, number 1 still goes to John Carter. As promised, here are the top 20 box office bombs, adjusted for inflation. Interestingly, Onward still holds on to its number 7 spot. Most of the list looks a little different though, with the inclusion of Sahara, Jack the Giant Slayer, King Arthur, Legend of the Sword, and Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets. John Carter and the Lone Ranger still hold their 2 top spots, regardless of whether inflation is considered, with staggering $372 million and $385 million losses. Meaning no matter how you look at it, those 2 truly are the worst of the worst. As you can imagine, the top 20 list is changing pretty constantly. 6 movies in the top 20 were only from the last 2 years. Now this project spanned from July to November 2023, and it's becoming increasingly likely that another film will join this list soon. And that's the newest Marvel film, The Marvels. The movie had a marketing campaign that could generously be labeled as all over the place, and started out with a tone of a wacky comedy accompanied by a Beastie Boys song. As the movie got closer to release, however, the marketing department pivoted hard, desperately trying to remarket the movie as dark and gritty, and relying heavily on nostalgia from previous MCU entries. The movie had an opening weekend debut of just $109 million worldwide, and marking the lowest domestic debut of an MCU film yet. Now there's 2 points of reference we can look at to determine how the Marvels might fare down the line. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, another Marvel film, also lost money at the box office this year, and was largely viewed as a disappointment. But that movie had a worldwide opening weekend of $227 million, more than double that of the Marvels. Coincidentally, the Marvels has virtually the same budget as The Flash, both having a total budget of $370 million, and even The Flash's worldwide opening weekend was $139 million, a full $30 million more than the Marvels. And still, The Flash went on to land at number 12 on this list. Where the Marvels actually ends up is too hard to call this early on in its run, but somewhere around The Flash's total gross might be an appropriate expectation. However, if the movie has long legs, or Disney just keeps it in theaters for months and months, it might end up doing better than expected. Regardless, the film is still a massive disappointment for Disney, and 2023 can't seem to end fast enough for the studio, which is on the verge of its 3rd film released this year to make it onto this list. Another movie right on the edge of inclusion is Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon. The film had a staggering $200 million budget and an estimated $100 million marketing budget, with Leonardo DiCaprio reportedly paid $40 million for the project. However, if Killers of the Flower Moon is able to clear about $175 million worldwide, it will avoid a place on the top 20. I want to circle back to a topic I briefly mentioned near the beginning of the video, and that's how studios will sometimes use their leverage to get a higher percentage the first few weeks of a film's run. Now this isn't nearly true for every movie released, and often it's the highly anticipated films that these skewed percentages apply to. Think Avatar: The Way of Water, Star Wars: The Force Awakens, or Spider-Man: No Way Home. But I want to talk about Avatar: The Way of Water specifically, because it's a great example of how skewing the percentages can affect the final numbers. It's also a very rare example of a public reveal of the terms that a studio negotiated with theaters. At the time of this recording, Avatar 2 is the 3rd highest grossing movie of all time, with a worldwide box office total of $2.3 billion. The movie had a production budget of $400 million, but with marketing and distribution and other obligations such as profit participations and residuals, which is additional compensation that occasionally actors, directors, or producers make on the back end based on the performance of the film. Anyway, that all adds up to an absolutely unbelievable total budget of $987 million. If the film had only the standard percentage split that the majority of movies get, which as a reminder is 55% domestic, 40% international, and 25% for China, Avatar 2 would have made $993.8 million, and after subtracting the gargantuan budget, the third highest grossing movie of all time, a $2.3 billion gross, would have ended its run with a theatrical profit of just $6.8 million. Fortunately for Disney, they were able to negotiate a fantastic deal for themselves on this one. For the entire duration of Avatar: The Way of Water's theatrical run, the studio got 65% of the domestic cut, 55% of the international cut, and still 25% of China's. Also, China doesn't seem to ever budge on this number, no matter what the film is. And after the theaters took their piece, Disney actually walked away with $283.7 million, which means virtually their entire theatrical profit was a result of those percentage split adjustments. If we go back to our original Guardians of the Galaxy 3 example, the best case scenario I can see the studio negotiating for this particular film would be around 65% domestic, 45% international, and 25% for China. Now, if those percentages didn't drop down at any time during the film's release, which to be fair would be highly unusual. Usually the longer a movie's being played, the more the percentage sways in favor of the theater. But if not, Guardians 3 could have made a small theatrical profit of as much as $34.9 million, as opposed to a loss of $21 million I demonstrated earlier using the standard percentages. Now, I don't want to cause confusion here. The percentages I used in the top 20 are appropriate, as those best case scenario percentages are not the norm for most movies released, especially films that studios know are tracking to perform poorly. With very rare exception, it's almost impossible to know which movies were negotiated with a higher studio percentage, and specifically how much that percentage change actually is. Which is why I gave every film in contention for a spot on the list the same treatment across the board. Holy sh**. As I'm wrapping things up, the Marvels just dropped 78%, which is the worst second weekend drop for any comic book movie ever. Unfortunately for Disney, this one might actually be destined for the top 10. One final note, there will be some who disagree with the percentages I'm using, and have multipliers and percentages that they insist are correct, and that's completely fine. I've done the best I can to compile the information available on the internet, as well as consult with a former theater manager who interacted with these numbers and contracts for years, and helped me narrow down the most accurate average domestic percentage throughout the theatrical life of a film. Like I said at the beginning, my goal with this project was to definitively determine what the actual biggest box office bombs are, and to provide some clarity into the complicated world of box office calculations. And I hope I succeeded. Because the truth is, these calculations are something that we aren't supposed to know. Studios don't want the public to know just how much money their flops lose them. And it often won't be until years later that the true numbers are revealed, as studios hope by then that people, and investors, will simply forget, and that each financial blow will be cushioned by home media sales, merchandising, and of course, the passage of time. Thanks for coming with me on this journey through the biggest box office bombs of all time, and remembering the truly monumental disasters that studios hope we've all long forgotten.